What's up YouTube? So big news is the Sony A7S III has just been released and you can pre-order it and it should be available in September for shipping. This is big news in the camera world because it's following on from the very popular Sony A7S Mark II. It's nice to talk about it and let's go through 7 different features that this camera has that's going to blow your mind. This camera has been much anticipated for the past few years and it's pretty much going to sell itself. So should you empty your retirement fund, it's not cheap, but hey, high-end cameras aren't cheap. Number 1, 15 stops of dynamic range. I mean, that is just insane by anyone's standards, and by the way, the human eye sees roughly 20 stops of dynamic range. So dynamic range in photography terms simply describes the difference between the minimum and the maximum intensities of light at different areas, or basically the dark and the white parts of your image. And remember, the higher the dynamic range, the more information you can retain in the highlights and shadows. So in the real world, you never really see pure black or white, you actually see varying light intensities of those colors. And that's why it's important to have dynamic range. So dynamic range itself is actually measured in stops, and this camera can do 15 stops, as I said. But what's the purpose of the dynamic range? Well, have a look at this photo as an example. So this was taken using 13.9 stops of dynamic range. And remember, because of the high dynamic range, we can recover more information in the shadows and the highlights. Next is a new improved sensor system on the Sony A7S III. It only has a 12 megapixel sensor. I mean, the camera that I'm shooting on at the moment has a 24 megapixel sensor. So why did they do this? Well, I think this camera is primarily going to be aimed at people who shoot video. Because it also has a fully articulated screen, which is primarily aimed at vloggers, and most photographers don't really care about things like that. However, it's nice to have a pop-up screen when you need it. So this camera is going to have a full frame sensor. I think it's 35.6 millimeters by 24 mil, which is full frame, as opposed to the camera that I'm shooting on currently, which is an APS-C size sensor, which is 23 millimeters. So a big difference with a crop factor and everything. Do you really notice those things? I don't know. If you're professional, you definitely want to use full frame. So the Sony A7S III is supposed to deliver much better low light shooting capabilities and a better sensor readout, which pretty much eliminates all the issues you had with rolling shutters, especially on this camera. I have this camera which does have the issue with rolling shutter. It's not such a big deal. I mean, you don't film like that, do you? But so this is the Beyond's XR processor. It's 2 processors on the camera and it should speed up your processing by 8 times compared to the old Beyond's X. This gives you the big pixels that Sony have been going on about in the recent interviews. The next feature is 10-bit 422. Now what the hell is 10-bit 422, you might ask? Well, 10-bit just actually means that you've got more colors to play with. In conventional cameras like the one I have now, it's an 8-bit camera, which means you have 256 shades of R, G, and B, red, green, and blue channels. So it only records roughly 16.7 million colors. However, on a 10-bit system, you get a lot more colors per pixel, which actually means you can record up to 1 billion different color variances on your camera. Let me explain 422 for you in this diagram. So let's imagine for a second we have 4 rows of pixel on the top, which is row A, and another set of samples called row B. If we just look at 442 for example, and we look at the first number, which is 4, that is the luma channel or the brightness value. And that is sampled for every single pixel on the top row as well as the second sample on the bottom row. Now let's look at the second number, which is a 4. Well, that's just the RGB sample that it does on the first row. So we notice that it takes a sample from 1 and 3, and then those samples are just copied over to the second and the third pixels of the first sample. Now notice there's a third number on top of that 422. The second one actually is just taking the second sample. So it just means that we're taking another sample from this row of pixels, but we're going to sample pixel number 2 and pixel number 4. Then pixel number 2 and pixel number 4 will be copied over to pixel 1 and 3. This gives us sort of an averaged out sample. But what about 420, which is what most cameras have? Well, again, if you notice, the second row has 0 and the first row has 2. Well, the first row just gets sampled on 1 and 3, and those get copied to every single other sample that it would have done. And this is what gives 420 less color information generally. The next feature this camera can do is 4K 120 FPS. Now, this has been one of the features that people have been complaining about for ages, is getting 120p in 4K on the Sony cameras. This camera can do 4K 120p in 10-bit 422 and you'll still have sound. You don't actually have to use the S and Q dial at the top of your camera, which is pretty mind-blowing. So the 4K 120p isn't perfect, there is a 1.1 crop factor, however that's pretty negligible and really small. The other thing is you can pretty much shoot for over an hour on this camera using 4K 120p, which you can't do with the Canon R5, which has just been released, which does shoot 8K, but what's the point of the whole thing's overheating anyway, right? So the A7S III also has an updated IBIS system, which is inbuilt image stabilization. I believe there's two modes, active and standard. I think active just crops into your frame 10%, but I believe the 4K already has that mode built in to the 1.1 crop factor. But apparently the 4K footage looks really good. No need for image stabilization anyway. As for the electronic viewfinder on the Sony A7S III, it has 9.4 million dots, and as of July 2020, this is the highest that any other camera has been able to achieve, which is pretty insane. And as I said before, it's got a 3.2-inch fully articulating screen on the back. But having looked at some of the sample photos that I've seen, I don't think many photographers are going to be unimpressed by the quality that they get. It pretty much holds up to the Canon R5's 8K video that people have been talking about. Some Sony users will be happy to know that there's a completely new menu system as well. And you can navigate this using the new touchscreen. And yes, you can actually touch the individual settings and set them on the screen, which is a nice improvement. Once you go to movie mode on your dial, it'll actually change the menu to give you mostly movie orientated settings. Most people didn't like the old menu system on the Sony, so this might actually get a whole new breed of Sony users interested in their cameras. So there you have it, the Sony A7S III. This is not going to be a cheap camera. I think the body only is roughly $3,700, and there's a lot of high rollers out there. If you wanted to buy that camera like me from Australia, which I won't do because I can't afford it, it's roughly $5,900. I mean, you could buy a small car for that kind of thing. But what do I know? I'm just a peasant. There's a lot of people out there with a lot of spare cash and they're definitely willing to spend it, especially on this camera. Hopefully you got something out of this video today. If you did, maybe hit that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it, and see you again next time.